The office buzzed with nervous energy as the employees of LyraTech gathered in the glass-walled conference room. Some clutched tablets, others crossed their arms defensively, but all of them shared the same unease. They knew something was about to go down. The kind of something that left careers in ashes. At the center stood Karen Voss, the icy CEO known for her stilettos, power suits, and a smile that never reached her eyes. With her platinum blonde bob angled like a blade and arms folded across her designer blouse, she scanned the room like a hawk surveying prey. And then her eyes landed on Elias Monroe. Before I go on, I know you are enjoying the story, so I would really appreciate it if you give this video a like, smash the subscribe button down below, and turn on the bell notification to get notified whenever I drop a new video. Alright, let's continue. Elias stood near the back, hunched slightly, leaning on his polished wooden cane. His left hand trembled faintly, Parkinson's, diagnosed years ago. He wore a brown corduroy blazer, the kind with elbow patches that smelled faintly of machine oil and old paper. The rest of the team barely noticed him anymore. For the past year, Karen had been slowly pushing him out, stripping him of responsibilities, excluding him from meetings, removing his name from group emails. He was the ghost of LyraTech's past. And today, she would exorcise him. "I'm going to make this quick," Karen said, her voice slicing through the murmurs like glass. "We're restructuring for innovation. For the future. That means some of the older systems and staff are no longer compatible with our direction." She turned fully toward Elias. "Elias Monroe, effective immediately, your contract with LyraTech is terminated." No compassion, no acknowledgement of his decades of work, just a cold public dismissal. "Security will escort you to clear your desk." A ripple ran through the room. A few eyes widened. A couple of interns looked confused. But no one said a word. Karen's wrath was legendary, and challenging her was career suicide. Elias, for his part, said nothing. He didn't flinch, didn't protest. He just looked at her quietly, eyes steady behind thick glasses. His fingers tightened on the head of his cane for a moment, just a flicker, but then he nodded. Karen's lips curved into a faint smile, almost pleased by his silence. "We appreciate your contributions. But let's be honest. The future doesn't run on nostalgia. It runs on code, creativity, and youth." Elias turned toward the door slowly, every step deliberate, the cane tapping softly against the polished concrete floor. No goodbyes. No farewells. Just the quiet march of a man leaving behind everything he'd helped build. As he walked out, no one noticed the way he reached into his coat pocket and pressed a small button on a key fob. No one heard the soft click that came from deep in the server room. But he heard it, and he smiled. Behind him, Karen continued the meeting like nothing had happened. She clicked to the next slide on her presentation, titled Project Orion, the future of cleantech AI. Bright graphs, patent numbers, estimated profits, a bold vision for the future built on foundations no one in that room truly understood, except the man they'd just thrown away. Outside, in the crisp late afternoon air, Elias took a deep breath. The sky stretched out in soft blue streaks above the parking lot. His hands trembled slightly as he reached his car, an aging silver Volvo, and slid into the driver's seat. The world had changed since he'd started LyraTech with two friends in a dusty garage. Back then, it had been about invention. Now it was about control. But what Karen didn't know, what no one knew, was that Elias hadn't just been the company's first engineer. He had been its soul. And he had kept receipts. As he drove away, a soft light blinked on the dashboard console. The secure drive in his glove box had just synced with the company's servers for the final time. Every document, every patent, every piece of code he had authored under their roof, but never legally transferred, was now in his possession. Not stolen. Reclaimed. The moment Karen signed off on his termination without consulting legal, she'd triggered a clause buried in his contract. She thought she'd erased him. In reality, she'd just handed him the keys. Elias's mouth curled into a smile as he turned onto the freeway. The tremor in his hand was still there, but the fire in his chest burned steady and clear. For the first time in years, he felt weightless. Karen thought he was dead weight, a liability. But she didn't realize she had just fired the man who owned everything. And now he was going to take it all back, one patent at a time. Elias's apartment was quiet, tucked in the corner of a faded brick building just beyond the city's industrial belt. The hall smelled like old coffee and varnish, and the elevator groaned before lurching upward to the third floor. Inside his unit, there were no signs of luxury, just practicality. A worn leather armchair beside a reading lamp, a vintage drafting table stained with ink, and metal filing cabinets lined in precise rows like silent sentinels. To most, it looked like a relic of a forgotten time. But Elias knew better. Every drawer was a vault. Every folder a weapon. He stepped inside, closed the door behind him, and let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding since Karen's announcement. The tremor in his hand pulsed again, subtle but insistent. He walked past the kitchen, more paperwork than food in the fridge, and went straight to the far wall. With practiced hands, he unlocked a hidden latch behind a framed schematic. A panel clicked. Behind it was a heavy safe with a biometric scanner. He pressed his thumb against the pad. Click. The lock disengaged with a satisfying clunk. The safe opened to reveal a thick accordion folder labeled in block letters. Original IP, LyraTech. Inside were yellowing patent filings, prototype diagrams, email printouts, and a document stamped and notarized nearly 30 years ago. A founder's agreement. It bore 3 names, Elias Monroe, Richard Voss, and Daniel Liu. Richard, Karen's father, had been the original CEO, a man of vision and ethics, and he had made sure that Elias retained personal ownership of his inventions. The agreement made it crystal clear. Elias never transferred his intellectual property to the company, only licensed it, renewably, at his discretion. Karen had never bothered reading the old agreements. Too confident, too eager to erase the past. She assumed Elias's patents had long been absorbed into corporate assets. But legally, they remained his, and her public firing, done without severance or negotiation, had triggered a reversion clause. It was a rare safeguard her father had insisted on back in the day. If Elias was ever terminated without cause, all licensing rights would terminate immediately. In that moment, LyraTech had become a multi-million-dollar squatter on his intellectual property. Before I go on, I know you are enjoying the story, so I would really appreciate it if you give this video a like, smash the subscribe button down below, and turn on the bell notification to get notified whenever I drop a new video. Alright, let's continue. He ran his fingers across the diagrams. The Orion engine. The adaptive grid. Pulse core. Innovations hailed as revolutionary by the tech world. All of them birthed in Elias's notebooks, refined through late nights and soldered circuits. Karen had monetized his work with arrogance and flash, not understanding the depth of what she stood on. She didn't see a foundation, she saw a podium. And now that podium was crumbling. Elias opened his laptop and began uploading the secured documents to his encrypted drive. He knew the legal landscape inside out. He'd studied it for years in silence, biding his time. A folder labeled Contingency Plan blinked onto the screen. Within it were drafted cease and desist notices, legal declarations, and annotated patent logs. All he had to do was attach dates and signatures. His fingers trembled slightly as he typed, but his mind was clear. Steady. The kind of clarity that came only when you had nothing left to lose, and everything to reclaim. The computer chimed, sync complete. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. Memories swam through him, his first prototype sparking on a cluttered table, Richard Voss shaking his hand and calling him the brain, Karen as a child watching him work, curious and wide-eyed. Somewhere along the way, she'd traded curiosity for conquest. She'd learned how to win, but not how to build. And that, Elias realized, was her fatal flaw. Later that night, he received an email. It was from someone he hadn't spoken to in years, Richard's former assistant, now a paralegal. Heard what happened? I found something in the archives you might want to see. Karen may have broken more than just your contract. A file was attached, audio. Elias clicked play. It was a recording from a board meeting 2 months ago. Karen was speaking candidly, arrogantly, about scrubbing the old contracts and burying Monroe before he remembers he still owns us. Her voice dripped with malice. The room had laughed. Elias didn't. He sat in the dark for a long time after the audio ended. Outside, the city murmured its late-night lullaby of sirens and wind. Elias reached for the rotary phone he kept on a side table. Its line wasn't traceable. He dialed a number burned into memory. "Loren," he said when the line picked up. "It's Elias. I think it's time." The voice on the other end paused. "You sure? I just triggered the reversion clause. And I have more than enough to go to court." A pause, then a low whistle. "Well, well, let the reckoning begin." Elias hung up and turned back to the window. Karen thought she had buried him. But what she didn't know was that ghosts didn't disappear. They haunt. And Elias Monroe was about to haunt her empire to the ground. The ballroom shimmered in gold and glass, a cathedral of ambition polished to perfection. Karen Voss stood center stage beneath a cascading chandelier, surrounded by wealthy investors, venture capitalists, and tech media elites, all dressed in black tie polish and holding crystal glasses. It was LyraTech's 10-year anniversary under her leadership and the launch of Project Orion, her crowning achievement. She grinned beneath flawless makeup, framed by projection screens displaying blueprints of sleek energy systems, revolutionary AI schematics, and profit forecasts climbing like rockets. But none of those digital triumphs were hers. Every bolt, every line of code, every spark of brilliance had come from the man she had so publicly discarded. "I want to thank everyone who believed in our mission," Karen declared, her voice syrupy smooth through the mic. "Project Orion is not just a product, it's a paradigm shift. By next quarter, we'll begin distribution across 3 continents. The global energy grid will be rebuilt in our image, and every cent of that growth will begin right here." Applause erupted. Champagne glasses clinked. Investors nodded to one another with satisfied grins. No one questioned her. She was sleek, bold, and brutal, qualities the market devoured. As she stepped down from the stage, her heels clacked with authority on the polished marble. Her assistant rushed to her side. "We just secured another round from Lennox Capital. 40 million. They want early licensing for Europe," he whispered. Karen smirked. "Good. Push the NDA and fast-track them, before any of the competition sniffs too deep." She didn't notice the young man near the refreshment table. Early 30s, buzz-cut, wearing a modest gray suit, far too quiet for this room. He wasn't sipping champagne or laughing with the tech crowd. He was recording. His name was Nolan Beckett, an independent investor who had been following the company's rise for 2 years. His brother, a former LyraTech engineer, had told him odd stories, erased credits, ghostwriters for patents, and one old man who seemed to vanish from the company's history. When he'd watched Elias Monroe walk out of LyraTech with no fanfare and no statement, something hadn't sat right. Now, as Karen laughed near the CEO circle, Nolan hit record on his phone. Karen leaned into a group of venture partners, her voice dropping but not enough. Firing Elias was a mercy, honestly. Men couldn't even hold a pen without shaking. Sad, really. But at least we don't have to tiptoe around his antique licensing agreements anymore. We cleaned house, and now the company's entirely ours. A woman laughed politely. "You're sure none of the IP ties back to him?" Karen's voice hardened. "We had the archives scrubbed. His name's gone. If he ever had a claim, it's dead now. I own everything that matters." Nolan's expression didn't change, but his hand slid his phone into his pocket. The recording was crisp, time-stamped, and damning. Not just because of what Karen had said, but because Nolan had once seen that antique licensing agreement himself. In a storage room. It had Elias's name in bold, signed by Richard Voss. And now he had Karen on tape admitting she had knowingly erased it. He left before the dessert trays rolled in. Back in his apartment, Nolan drafted an email and attached the audio file. The subject line was simple: "This belongs to you." He sent it to the address he'd found buried in the footer of a patent licensing site, monroe.innovates@protonmail.com. He didn't expect a reply. But 2 hours later, he got one. "Thank you. You've confirmed everything I needed. Keep this quiet. You'll be hearing more publicly." The next morning, Elias sat at his drafting table, the message open on one screen, Karen's voice replaying from another. His cane leaned beside him, and his hands, though still unsteady, were decisive as they clicked through legal files. He uploaded the recording into a digital folder labeled Exhibit C. Next to it was Exhibit A, the founder's agreement. Exhibit B, notarized patent filings. The case was building, and Karen had handed him the final nail herself, wrapped in laughter and champagne. Across town, Karen's team celebrated the investment milestone with morning mimosas. She sat in her office, legs crossed, reviewing projections and smiling at headlines. LyraTech to reshape energy grid with Project Orion. There was no mention of Elias. No hint of danger. She had no idea that the man she dismissed was preparing a legal warhead. That the very platform she stood on was soaked in gasoline, and he now held the match. In the silence of his apartment, Elias turned off the screen and leaned back, a rare stillness in his eyes. For years, he had let her strip him of credit, of power, of dignity. But not anymore. The tide had shifted. The game was no longer about invention. It was about reckoning. And Elias Monroe was done being silent. Rain fell like nails against the courtroom steps as Elias approached, his cane steady on the slick pavement. A storm was coming, but not just from the sky. Inside the courthouse, fluorescent lights flickered above polished floors, and tension stretched as tightly as the security ropes lining the hall. Elias wore a charcoal gray suit that hung a bit loose on his frame, but his eyes were sharp, unflinching. In his weathered leather briefcase were documents that could gut $1 billion empire. At the security desk, a young guard barely looked up. Name? Elias Monroe. Plaintiff. A brief silence. Then the guard straightened. Oh, you're that Monroe. Elias offered nothing but a nod, stepping through the scanner as his cane tapped out a rhythm of inevitability. Upstairs, in courtroom 6B, the press was already gathering. Word had leaked that a retired engineer was suing LyraTech for intellectual property theft, and that the defendant was none other than Karen Voss, Silicon Valley's reigning tech queen. No one understood how a man nearly forgotten could challenge a company so vast, but they were here to witness what they assumed would be a short, humiliating loss. Karen arrived 15 minutes later, trailed by 3 lawyers and a publicist. She wore black, sharp and imposing, her chin tilted slightly upward. She glanced at Elias once as she entered, expression unreadable, but her hands betrayed her, tapping against her side, knuckles taut. She had received the official complaint just days ago, filed under federal statute, claiming full ownership of over a dozen patents. It came with contracts, timestamps, and, to her horror, a recording of her voice mocking Elias and confirming her efforts to erase his legacy. She hadn't seen that one coming. Mr. Monroe, her lead attorney began as the judge entered, has filed suit under IP reversion clauses originally drafted in the 1990s. He claims that upon his termination without cause, all licensing rights were rescinded. We contend that no such clause is enforceable or relevant to current LyraTech operations. Judge Halvorson, a sharp-eyed woman with silver hair and a reputation for surgical precision, held up the printed founder's agreement. This document, Mr. Monroe, is your claim that these technologies, specifically those used in Project Orion, were never transferred, only licensed. Elias nodded. That's correct, Your Honor. The license was contingent upon ongoing collaboration. Termination without cause, without severance, nullified it. Karen leaned forward, trying to meet his gaze, but Elias never looked her way. Instead, he slid forward Exhibit B, a bound collection of patent numbers bearing only his name. And these are your original filings? The judge asked. Yes. Filed and notarized. Stamped by the United States Patent Office. Dates align with LyraTech's use of the technology. The defense scrambled, whispering furiously. Karen's confidence began to falter, her fingers twitching as her lawyer leaned in. The company assumed full ownership of all proprietary technology after Richard Voss's death, he said quickly. Elias opened Exhibit C, the audio recording. And here's your CEO, 2 months ago, confirming that she deliberately scrubbed all contracts and erased my involvement, while also admitting she fired me because of my disability. Karen's head snapped toward the screen as her own voice filled the courtroom. We had the archives scrubbed. His name's gone. If he ever had a claim, it's dead now. I own everything that matters. A beat of silence followed, then murmurs. The press shifted. One reporter's mouth dropped open. The judge raised her eyebrows, not in surprise, but in the slow, dawning awareness that this wasn't a frivolous case. This was a time bomb with a lit fuse. Court will recess until tomorrow morning, Judge Halvorson said. Mr. Monroe, the burden of proof is on you, but so far, you've provided a compelling foundation. I recommend both parties prepare for full discovery. Karen stood abruptly and stormed out, heels slamming like gunshots on the marble. Cameras clicked as she passed, and her PR manager tried to block reporters. But the damage was already in motion. Headlines began uploading before she reached the car. Engineer suing LyraTech over stolen patents, recording leaked. Her empire had just taken its first real punch. Elias remained behind, slowly gathering his documents as the crowd cleared. His hands still trembled, but not from fear. This wasn't a courtroom for him. It was a crucible. And as he walked into the drizzle outside, thunder rolling behind him, Elias knew the storm had only just begun. He wasn't just suing for credit. He was demanding justice. And Karen had no idea how much she'd already lost. The morning news hit like a bullet train. Engineer's lawsuit against LyraTech goes viral. CEO accused of fraud and disability discrimination. The headlines rolled across cable news tickers, social feeds, and investor inboxes. Elias's face, once hidden in the back rooms of innovation, now stared out from television screens across the country. His grainy ID badge photo from the early days of LyraTech, paired with courtroom sketches, was plastered beside a still of Karen Voss mid-stride, sunglasses on, jaw clenched. But it was the audio that caused the explosion. His Exhibit C had leaked. Whether intentional or not, the damage was irreversible. The recording played over and over again on cable shows and tech podcasts. We had the archives scrubbed. His name's gone. If he ever had a claim, it's dead now. I own everything that matters. The coldness in her voice struck a nerve with viewers, especially paired with Elias's calm, quiet presence in court. The public saw the classic underdog, the brilliant old man cast aside, and rallied behind him like wildfire. At LyraTech's downtown headquarters, chaos churned through every floor. PR firms flooded Karen's inbox. Investors demanded emergency calls. Employees stared at their screens, stunned, watching their once unshakable CEO unravel in real time. The board of directors called an emergency meeting at noon. By then, the company's stock had dropped 17% in a single trading session. Rumors began swirling that Karen had falsified documents, bypassed legal review, and intentionally concealed licensing contracts from regulators. In the boardroom, Karen stood at the head of the table, pale but defiant. Her voice, once magnetic, now shook beneath the weight of unspoken blame. "This is a narrative war, not a legal one," she snapped, pacing. "We control the story. Monroe is just noise. He doesn't have the money or stamina to take this the distance. We bury him in litigation, call the licensing agreement outdated, and file a countersuit." Silence followed. Then one of the board members, a man who'd once toasted her at her promotion, spoke quietly. "You didn't disclose the licensing clause in the acquisition papers from 5 years ago." Karen stopped. Her eyes narrowed. "Excuse me? If Monroe's contract is valid and you suppressed it, that makes our entire product line a liability. Not just Project Orion. Everything built off his patents would have to cease operations, which includes 68% of our revenue stream." A second board member added, "We've been told the Department of Commerce is looking into this. You didn't just erase a man, you may have misrepresented the company to federal regulators." Karen's mouth opened, but no sound came. Meanwhile, across town, Elias sat with his legal team in a quiet, sunlit conference room. Papers covered the table, and Nolan Beckett, now assisting Elias pro bono, scanned through a digital archive of corporate memos Karen's assistant had anonymously leaked. One message in particular sent a chill through the room. It was a forwarded email from Karen to her legal counsel, dated just weeks before Elias's firing. "Get rid of Monroe. I don't care how we spin it. If he stays, he becomes a symbol. I want his name out of the press, out of the patent logs, out of the company. Make it clean." Elias closed his eyes for a long moment. Not out of anger, but mourning. This wasn't just about pride anymore. Karen had tried to erase his existence from the very company he helped build. Not because he'd failed, but because she feared what he still knew. What he still was. "We need to go public," Nolan said quietly. "Press conference. Today. We don't just fight in court anymore. We take the narrative." Elias nodded. "Prepare the statement. I'll read it myself." That afternoon, in front of a small podium outside the courthouse, Elias stepped into the sunlight and spoke. Cameras clicked. Microphones extended like grasping fingers. But he wasn't nervous. Not anymore. "My name is Elias Monroe. I co-founded LyraTech over 3 decades ago. The technology that built that company, every major innovation, was created by my hands. I was fired without cause. I was mocked, erased, and buried. But I'm still here. And I won't be silent anymore." His voice didn't waver. "Not once. I don't want revenge. I want truth. And I want the next generation of creators to know, your work matters. Your name matters. Never let anyone take that from you." The press erupted in questions, but Elias stepped down, his cane steady on the concrete. Behind him, the building loomed tall, just another monument built on stolen genius. Inside that tower, Karen Voss watched the broadcast with a hollow look. She had tried to erase a man. But now the world was remembering him, louder than she ever imagined. The courtroom was packed wall to wall. Reporters elbowed for space along the rear benches, while camera crews waited just outside, banned by the judge but hungry for every shred of drama that might leak from inside. The air buzzed with the weight of history and humiliation, because today, The court would begin reviewing the official patent logbooks and licensing contracts in full public session. What had started as a quiet civil suit had exploded into the trial of the decade, and for Karen Voss, it was a slow, surgical unmasking of every secret she thought she'd buried. Elias sat calmly at the plaintiff's table, his posture straightened by purpose. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice, when needed, was resolute. Across from him, Karen sat in a crisp navy suit, her signature confidence now strained at the seams. No amount of designer polish could hide the tension pulling at her jaw, the subtle tapping of her nails beneath the desk, or the side glances to her attorneys, who no longer looked convinced they were fighting for the winning side. "Your Honor," Elias's attorney began, "we submit into evidence Patent 9824-F, originally filed under Elias Monroe on July 3, 1996. We also submit his licensing agreement with LyraTech, signed by the late Richard Voss, stating that all usage of Monroe's technologies were conditional and would revert fully to Mr. Monroe upon his termination without cause." Judge Halvorson lifted the worn document, aged but clearly legible. She adjusted her glasses, scanned the highlighted clauses, and looked directly at Karen's lead counsel. "Do you dispute this contract's validity?" The lawyer stood, but his voice lacked the conviction he'd once carried. "We contend the clause is antiquated, Your Honor, and that subsequent versions of Project Orion were sufficiently modified to no longer rely solely on Mr. Monroe's original technology." Elias's attorney didn't even blink. "We anticipated that claim, which is why we brought an independent engineer to reverse engineer Orion's architecture. What he found was that 93% of the framework, code, design logic, energy flow architecture is identical to Monroe's protected work." Gasps echoed across the courtroom. Karen's face turned rigid. The defense tried to pivot. Regardless, the company's board approved the direction. Elias rose slowly, asking to address the judge directly. She granted it. He stepped forward, cane clicking once against the floor, then leaned on the podium. "I don't want their money. I don't want their apologies. I want accountability. Not just for me, but for every inventor, every thinker who was told they were too old, too broken, too slow to matter. I was removed because I had tremors in my hands. They thought that meant I had no strength left. But my mind was still sharp, my spirit intact. And everything LyraTech is today was built on what I created." His voice cracked just once, but it only made him stronger. "They buried me under silence. But they didn't know I had copies. They didn't know I had allies. They didn't know I was willing to lose everything, just to reclaim my name." As he stepped back, the entire courtroom remained quiet. A silence that trembled with awe. Karen shifted, her composure finally starting to fracture. The cracks were now undeniable. Her board had begun leaking internal memos to the press. 2 former employees had stepped forward to confirm her attempts to bury documentation. One engineer provided an email chain showing how Karen had falsified product development timelines to avoid acknowledging Elias's contribution. The judge called for a recess. As the court emptied, a young woman from the back rows approached Elias cautiously. "I just wanted to thank you," she whispered. "I'm a developer. My former boss stole my code and claimed it as his. I didn't have the power to fight him. But watching you, you gave me courage." Elias placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "Then this fight isn't just mine." Outside, news broke fast. Federal regulators were now officially investigating LyraTech for corporate fraud. The SEC issued a statement. The Department of Commerce opened an inquiry into IP misrepresentation. Stock trading halted by mid-afternoon. Karen's name was now synonymous with scandal. Inside her corner office, she stood alone as the storm swirled around her. Her phone buzzed endlessly with missed calls, resignation notices, and board demands. The power she once wielded like a sword now hung over her like a guillotine. Elias had walked into that courtroom underestimated, patronized, and nearly forgotten. Now he was the architect of her downfall. Every fact, every signature, every painful truth laid bare in front of the world. And she couldn't stop it. Not anymore. The final day of the trial arrived beneath a sharp, unforgiving sky. The clouds hung low, bloated with stormlight, mirroring the weight that had gathered in the courtroom over the past week. Every seat was filled. Spectators clutched notepads, phones, and coffee cups like armor, bracing for whatever fallout was to come. Elias walked in quietly, a soft smile resting beneath his eyes. He didn't look like a man going into battle anymore. He looked like someone who had already won. Karen arrived 20 minutes late. Her usual entourage was absent. No lawyers flanked her. No assistants hovered nearby. Just her, diminished and visibly shaken. She sat down slowly, eyes red-rimmed, jaw tight, as if clenching her pride between her teeth. The court came to order. Judge Halvorsen addressed both sides without preamble. In light of overwhelming evidence presented by the plaintiff, including patent filings, licensing documents, whistleblower testimony, and digital correspondence confirming deliberate concealment of intellectual property, I am prepared to issue my ruling. The courtroom froze. It is the judgment of this court that Elias Monroe is the sole and rightful owner of the patents in question, specifically those connected to LyraTech as Project Orion and its subsidiaries. I hereby order an immediate cessation of all products utilizing said technologies and mandate that all licensing rights revert to Mr. Monroe, effective immediately. A ripple passed through the gallery like a physical force. Karen's head dropped slightly. A single breath escaped her lips, something between disbelief and collapse. But the judge wasn't done. Furthermore, in light of evidence confirming retaliatory termination due to Mr. Monroe's disability, I am referring this case to the Department of Labor and the Department of Justice for further investigation into civil rights violations. Monetary damages will be addressed in a separate hearing. This court is adjourned. The gavel cracked down like thunder. In that one sound, everything broke. Karen stood in a daze, as though the floor had shifted beneath her. Her gaze found Elias across the room, not with hatred, but hollow acceptance. There were no more cards to play. No more lies to stack. Her empire, once towering and gleaming, had been reduced to glass shards. Each truth Elias uncovered had sliced away her armor until nothing remained but the woman who thought she was untouchable, and found out she wasn't. Outside, a press swarm waited. Cameras clicked like applause. Elias exited slowly, greeted not with flashing lights, but a spontaneous round of clapping from the crowd lining the courthouse steps. Some people were crying. Others held handmade signs. Justice for inventors. Respect the roots. Monroe built this. Nolan Beckett stepped beside him, clapping once on the shoulder. You just made history. Elias didn't speak for a moment. The wind tugged gently at his coat, and for the first time in decades, the weight of silence no longer sat on his chest. I didn't want revenge, he said quietly. But the truth, it tastes better than I thought it would. 3 weeks later, LyraTech filed for restructuring. Their board removed Karen Voss in a closed-door vote. She walked away without severance under federal investigation, her name permanently etched into case law as a cautionary tale of ego and theft. Her reputation, once sterling, now stood beside every headline about fraud and betrayal. No longer the queen of innovation, just the footnote to someone else's genius. As for Elias Monroe, he declined interviews and book deals. He didn't want a movie, didn't care for a TED Talk. Instead, he took the settlement money and quietly founded the Monroe Foundation for Ethical Invention, offering legal support to young inventors, disabled engineers, and marginalized developers who'd been overlooked and silenced by powerful systems. His name appeared in textbooks. His patents were restored. His legacy was no longer whispered in the corners of conference rooms. It stood tall, proud, undeniable. One autumn afternoon, Elias returned to the original LyraTech site, now abandoned, its signage stripped and windows dark. He stood in front of the rusted gate, his cane planted firm in the gravel. This, he whispered, is where they tried to end me. Then he turned away, not out of bitterness but clarity. The ashes behind him didn't matter anymore, because what he carried forward was worth more than the company he lost. He had reclaimed his voice, and the world had finally listened.